The fifth book of the Dialogues of Lucius Annaeus Seneca, addressed to Novatus, of Anger, Book 3. 1. We will now, my Novatus, attempt to do that which you so especially long to do, that is, to drive out anger from our minds, or at all events, to curb it and restrain its impulses. This may sometimes be done openly and without concealment, when we are only suffering from a slight attack of this mischief, and at other times it must be done secretly, when our anger is excessively hot, and when every obstacle thrown in its way increases it and makes it blaze higher. It is important to know how great and how fresh its strength may be, and whether it can be driven forcibly back and suppressed, or whether we must give way to it until its first storm blow over, lest it sweep away with it our remedies themselves. We must deal with each case according to each man's character. Some yield to entreaties, others are rendered arrogant and masterful by submission. We may frighten some men out of their anger, while some may be turned from their purpose by reproaches, some by acknowledging oneself to be in the wrong, some by shame, and some by delay, a tardy remedy for a hasty disorder, which we ought only to use when all others have failed. For other passions admit of having their case put off, and may be healed at a later time, but the eager and self-destructive violence of anger does not grow up by slow degrees, but reaches its full height as soon as it begins. Nor does it, like other vices, merely disturb men's minds, but it takes them away and torments them till they are incapable of restraining themselves, and eager for the common ruin of all men. Nor does it rage merely against its object, but against every obstacle which it encounters on its way. The other vices move our minds. Anger hurls them headlong. If we are not able to withstand our passions, yet at any rate our passions ought to stand firm. But anger grows more and more powerful, like lightning flashes or hurricanes, or any other things which cannot stop themselves, because they do not proceed along, but fall from above. Other vices affect our judgment. Anger affects our sanity. Others come in mild attacks and grow unnoticed, but men's minds plunge abruptly into anger. There is no passion that is more frantic, more destructive to its own self. It is arrogant if successful, and frantic if it fails. Even when defeated, it does not grow weary, but if chance places its foe beyond its reach, it turns its teeth against itself. Its intensity is in no way regulated by its origin, for it rises to the greatest heights from the most trivial beginnings. 2. It passes over no time of life. No race of men is exempt from it. Some nations have been saved from the knowledge of luxury by the blessing of poverty. Some, through their active and wandering habits, have escaped from sloth. Those whose manners are unpolished and whose life is rustic know not chicanery and fraud and all the evils to which the courts of law give birth. But there is no race which is not excited by anger, which is equally powerful with Greeks and barbarians, and is just as ruinous among law-abiding folk as among those whose only law is that of the stronger. Finally, the other passions seize upon individuals. Anger is the only one which sometimes possesses a whole state. No entire people ever fell madly in love with a woman, nor did any nation ever set its affections altogether upon gain and profit. Ambition attacks single individuals. Ungovernable rage is the only passion that affects nations. People often fly into a passion by troops. Men and women, old men and boys, princes and populace all act alike, and the whole multitude, after being excited by a very few words, outdoes even its exciter. Men betake themselves straightway to fire and sword, and proclaim a war against their neighbours, or wage one against their countrymen. Whole houses are burned with the entire families which they contain, and he who but lately was honoured for his popular eloquence now finds that his speech moves people to rage. Legions aim their darts at their commander. The whole populace quarrels with the nobles. The Senate, without waiting for troops to be levied or appointing a general, hastily chooses leaders, for its anger chases well-born men through the houses of Rome and puts them to death with its own hand. Ambassadors are outraged, the law of nations violated, and unnatural madness seizes the state. Without allowing time for the general excitement to subside, fleets are straightway launched and laden with hastily enrolled soldiery. Without organization, without taking any auspices, the populace rushes into the field guided only by its anger, snatches up whatever comes first to hand by way of arms, and then atones by a great defeat for the reckless audacity of its anger. This is usually the fate of savage nations when they plunge into war. As soon as their easily excited minds are roused by the appearance of wrong having been done them, they straightway hasten forth, and, guided only by their wounded feelings, fall like an avalanche upon our legions, without either discipline, fear, or precaution, and wilfully seeking for danger. They delight in being struck, in pressing forward to meet the blow, writhing their bodies along the weapon, and perishing by a wound which they themselves make. 3. No doubt, you say, anger is very powerful and ruinous. Point out, therefore, how it may be cured. Yet, as I stated in my former books, Aristotle stands forth in defence of anger, and forbids it to be uprooted, saying that it is the spur of virtue, and that when it is taken away, our minds become weaponless and slow to attempt great exploits. It is therefore essential to prove its unseemliness and ferocity, and to place distinctly before our eyes how monstrous a thing it is that one man should rage against another, with what frantic violence he rushes to destroy alike himself and his foe, and overthrows those very things whose fall he himself must share. What, then? Can anyone call this man sane, who, as though caught up by a hurricane, does not go but is driven, and is the slave of a senseless disorder? He does not commit to another the duty of revenging him, but himself exacts it, raging alike in thought and deed, butchering those who are dearest to him, and for whose loss he himself will ere long weep. Will anyone give this passion as an assistant and companion to virtue, although it disturbs calm reason, without which virtue can do nothing? The strength which a sick man owes to a paroxysm of disease is neither lasting nor wholesome, and is strong only to its own destruction. You need not, therefore, imagine that I am wasting time over a useless task in defaming anger, as though men had not made up their minds about it, when there is someone, and he too, an illustrious philosopher, who assigns it services to perform, and speaks of it as useful and supplying energy for battles, for the management of business, and indeed for everything which requires to be conducted with spirit. Lest it should delude anyone into thinking that on certain occasions and in certain positions it may be useful, we must show its unbridled and frenzied madness. We must restore to it its attributes, the rack, the cord, the dungeon and the cross, the fires lighted round men's buried bodies, the hook that drags both living men and corpses, the different kinds of fetters and of punishments, the mutilations of limbs, the branding of the forehead, the dens of savage beasts. Anger should be represented as standing among these, her instruments, growing in an ominous and terrible fashion, herself more shocking than any of the means by which she gives vent to her fury. 4. There may be some doubt about the others, but at any rate no passion has a worse look. We have described the angry man's appearance in our former books, how sharp and keen he looks, at one time pale as his blood is driven inwards and backwards, at another with all the heat and fire of his body directed to his face, making it reddish-coloured as if stained with blood. His eyes now restless and starting out of his head, now set motionless in one fixed gaze. Add to this his teeth, which gnash against one another, as though he wished to eat somebody, with exactly the sound of a wild boar sharpening his tusks. Add also the cracking of his joints, the involuntary wringing of his hands, the frequent slaps he deals himself on the chest, his hurried breathing and deep-drawn sighs, his reeling body, his abrupt broken speech, and his trembling lips, which sometimes he draws tight as he hisses some curse through them. By Hercules, no wild beast, neither when tortured by hunger or with a weapon struck through its vitals, not even when it gathers its last breath to bite its slayer, looks so shocking as a man raging with anger. Listen, if you have leisure, to his words and threats. How dreadful is the language of his agonized mind! Would not every man wish to lay aside anger when he sees that it begins by injuring itself? When men employ anger as the most powerful of agents, consider it to be a proof of power, and reckon a speedy revenge among the greatest blessings of great prosperity, would you not wish me to warn them that he who is the slave of his own anger is not powerful, nor even free? Would you not wish me to warn all the more industrious and circumspect of men that while other evil passions assail the base, anger gradually obtains dominion over the minds even of learned and in other respects sensible men? So true is it that some declare anger to be a proof of straightforwardness, and it is commonly believed that the best-natured people are prone to it. 5. You ask me, whither does all this tend? To prove, I answer, that no one should imagine himself to be safe from anger, seeing that it rouses up even those who are naturally gentle and quiet to commit savage and violent acts. As strength of body and assiduous care of the health avail nothing against a pestilence, which attacks the strong and weak alike, so also steady and good-humoured people are just as liable to attacks of anger as those of unsettled character, and in the case of the former, it is both more to be ashamed of and more to be feared, because it makes a greater alteration in their habits. Now, as the first thing is not to be angry, the second to lay aside our anger, and the third to be able to heal the anger of others as well as our own, I will set forth first how we may avoid falling into anger, next how we may set ourselves free from it, and lastly how we may restrain an angry man, appease his wrath, and bring him back to his right mind. We shall succeed in avoiding anger if from time to time we lay before our minds all the vices connected with anger, and estimate it at its real value. It must be prosecuted before us and convicted. Its evils must be thoroughly investigated and exposed. That we may see what it is, let it be compared with the worst vices. Avarice scrapes together and amasses riches for some better man to use. Anger spends money. Few can indulge in it for nothing. How many slaves an angry master drives to run away or to commit suicide? How much more he loses by anger than the value of what he originally became angry about? Anger brings grief to a father, divorce to a husband, hatred to a magistrate, failure to a candidate for office. It is worse than luxury, because luxury enjoys its own pleasure, while anger enjoys another's pain. It is worse either than spitefulness or envy, for they wish that someone may become unhappy, while anger wishes to make him so. They are pleased when evil befalls one by accident, but anger cannot wait upon fortune. It desires to injure its victim personally, and is not satisfied merely with his being injured. Nothing is more dangerous than jealousy. It is produced by anger. Nothing is more ruinous than war. It is the outcome of powerful men's anger. And even the anger of humble private persons, though without arms or armies, is nevertheless war. Moreover, even if we pass over its immediate consequences, such as heavy losses, treacherous plots, and the constant anxiety produced by strife, anger pays a penalty at the same moment that it exacts one. It forswears human feelings. The latter urge us to love. Anger urges us to hatred. The latter bid us do men good. Anger bids us do them harm. Add to this that, although its rage arises from an excessive self-respect and appears to show high spirit, it really is contemptible and mean. For a man must be inferior to one by whom he thinks himself despised, whereas the truly great mind, which takes a true estimate of its own value, does not revenge an insult because it does not feel it. As weapons rebound from a hard surface, and solid substances hurt those who strike them, so also no insult can make a really great mind sensible to its presence, being weaker than that against which it is aimed. How far more glorious it is to throw back all wrongs and insults from oneself, like one wearing armour of proof against all weapons, for revenge is an admission that we have been hurt. That cannot be a great mind which is disturbed by injury. He who has hurt you must be either stronger or weaker than yourself. If he be weaker, spare him. If he be stronger, spare yourself. 6. There is no greater proof of magnanimity than that nothing which befalls you should be able to move you to anger. The higher region of the universe, being more excellently ordered and near to the stars, is never gathered into clouds, driven about by storms, or whirled around by cyclones. It is free from all disturbance. The lightnings flash in the region below it. In like manner, a lofty mind, always placid and dwelling in a serene atmosphere, restraining within itself all the impulses from which anger springs, is modest, commands respect, and remains calm and collected. None of which qualities will you find in an angry man, for who, when under the influence of grief and rage, does not first get rid of bashfulness? Who, when excited and confused and about to attack someone, does not fling away any habits of shamefacedness he may have possessed? What angry man attends to the number or routine of his duties, who uses moderate language, who keeps any part of his body quiet, who can guide himself when in full career? We shall find much profit in that sound maxim of Democritus, which defines peace of mind to consist in not labouring much or too much for our strength, either in public or private matters. A man's day, if he is engaged in many various occupations, never passes so happily that no man or no thing should give rise to some offence which makes the mind ripe for anger. Just as when one hurries through the crowded parts of the city, one cannot help jostling many people, and one cannot help slipping at one place, being hindered at another, and splashed at another, so when one's life is spent in disconnected pursuits and wanderings, one must meet with many troubles and many accusations. One man deceives our hopes, another delays their fulfillment, another destroys them. Our projects do not proceed according to our intention. No one is so favoured by fortune as to find her always on his side if he tempts her often. And from this it follows that he who sees several enterprises turn out contrary to his wishes becomes dissatisfied with both men and things, and on the slightest provocation flies into a rage with people, with undertakings, with places, with fortune, or with himself. In order, therefore, that the mind may be at peace, it ought not to be hurried hither and thither, nor, as I said before, wearied by labour at great matters, or matters whose attainment is beyond its strength. It is easy to fit one's shoulder to a light burden, and to shift it from one side to the other without dropping it. but we have difficulty in bearing the burdens which others' hands lay upon us, and when overweighted by them, we fling them off upon our neighbours. Even when we do stand upright under our load, we nevertheless reel beneath a weight which is beyond our strength. 7. Be assured that the same rule applies both to public and private life. Simple and manageable undertakings proceed according to the pleasure of the person in charge of them, but enormous ones, beyond his capacity to manage, are not easily undertaken. When he has got them to administer, they hinder him and press hard upon him, and just as he thinks that success is within his grasp, they collapse and carry him with them. Thus it comes about that a man's wishes are often disappointed if he does not apply himself to easy tasks, yet wishes that the tasks which he undertakes may be easy. Whenever you would attempt anything, first form an estimate both of your own powers, of the extent of the matter which you are undertaking, and of the means by which you are to accomplish it. For if you have to abandon your work when it is half done, the disappointment will sour your temper. In such cases, it makes a difference whether one is of an ardent or of a cold and unenterprising temperament. For failure will rouse a generous spirit to anger, and will move a sluggish and dull one to sorrow. Let our undertakings, therefore, be neither petty nor yet presumptuous and reckless. Let our hopes not range far from home. Let us attempt nothing which, if we succeed, will make us astonished at our success. 8. Since we know not how to endure an injury, let us take care not to receive one. We should live with the quietest and easiest tempered persons, not with anxious or with sullen ones. For our own habits are copied from those with whom we associate, and just as some bodily diseases are communicated by touch, so also the mind transfers its vices to its neighbours. A drunkard leads even those who reproach him to grow fond of wine. Profligate society will, if permitted, impair the morals even of robust-minded men. Avarice infects those nearest it with poison. Virtues do the same thing in the opposite direction, and improve all those with whom they are brought in contact. It is as good for one of unsettled principles to associate with better men than himself, as for an invalid to live in a warm country with a healthy climate. You will understand how much may be affected this way, if you observe how even wild beasts grow tame by dwelling among us, and how no animal, however ferocious, continues to be wild if it has long been accustomed to human companionship. All its savageness becomes softened, and amid peaceful scenes is gradually forgotten. We must add to this that the man who lives with quiet people is not only improved by their example, but also by the fact that he finds no reason for anger, and does not practice his vice. It will, therefore, be his duty to avoid all those who he knows will excite his anger. You ask who these are. Many will bring about the same thing by various means. A proud man will offend you by his disdain, a talkative man by his abuse, an impudent man by his insults, a spiteful man by his malice, a quarrelsome man by his wrangling, a braggart and liar by his vaingloriousness. You will not endure to be feared by a suspicious man, conquered by an obstinate one, or scorned by an ultra-refined one. Choose straightforward, good-natured, steady people, who will not provoke your wrath, and will bear with it. Those whose dispositions are yielding, polite, and suave will be of even greater service, provided they do not flatter, for excessive obsequiousness irritates bad-tempered men. One of my own friends was a good man indeed, but too prone to anger, and it was as dangerous to flatter him as to curse him. Caelius the orator, it is well known, was the worst-tempered man possible. It is said that once he was dining in his own chamber with an especially long-suffering client, but had great difficulty when thrown thus into a man's society to avoid quarrelling with him. The other thought it best to agree to whatever he said, and to play second fiddle. But Callias could not bear his obsequious agreement, and exclaimed, "Do contradict me in something, that there may be two of us." Yet even he, who was angry at not being angry, soon recovered his temper, because he had no one to fight with. If, then, we are conscious of an irascible disposition, let us especially choose for our friends those who will look and speak as we do. They will pamper us and lead us into a bad habit of listening to nothing that does not please us, but it will be good to give our anger respite and repose. Even those who are naturally crabbed and wild will yield to caresses. No creature continues either angry or frightened if you pat him. Whenever a controversy seems likely to be longer or more keenly disputed than usual, let us check its first beginnings before it gathers strength. A dispute nourishes itself as it proceeds, and takes hold of those who plunge too deeply into it. It is easier to stand aloof than to extricate oneself from a struggle. 9. Irascible men ought not to meddle with the more serious class of occupations, or, at any rate, ought to stop short of weariness in the pursuit of them. Their mind ought not to be engaged upon hard subjects, but handed over to pleasing arts. Let it be softened by reading poetry and interested by legendary history. Let it be treated with luxury and refinement. Pythagoras used to calm his troubled spirit by playing upon the lyre, and who does not know that trumpets and clarions are irritants, just as some airs are lullabies and soothe the mind? Green is good for wearied eyes, and some colours are grateful to weak sight, while the brightness of others is painful to it. In the same way, cheerful pursuits soothe unhealthy minds. We must avoid law courts, pleadings, verdicts, and everything else that aggravates our fault, and we ought no less to avoid bodily weariness, for it exalts all that is quiet and gentle in us, and rouses bitterness. For this reason, those who cannot trust their digestion when they are about to transact business of importance always allay their bile with food, for it is peculiarly irritated by fatigue, either because it draws the vital heat into the middle of the body and injures the blood and stops its circulation by the clogging of the veins, or else because the worn-out and weakened body reacts upon the mind. This is certainly the reason why those who are broken by ill health or age are more irascible than other men. Hunger also and thirst should be avoided for the same reason. They exasperate and irritate men's minds. It is an old saying that a weary man is quarrelsome, and so also is a hungry or a thirsty man, or one who is suffering from any cause whatever. For just as sores pain one at the slightest touch, and afterwards even at the fear of being touched, so an unsound mind takes offence at the slightest things, so that even a greeting, a letter, a speech, or a question provokes some men to anger. 10. That which is diseased can never bear to be handled without complaining. It is best, therefore, to apply remedies to oneself as soon as we feel that anything is wrong, to allow oneself as little license as possible in speech, and to restrain one's impetuosity. Now it is easy to detect the first growth of our passions. The symptoms precede the disorder. Just as the signs of storms and rain come before the storms themselves, so there are certain forerunners of anger, love, and all the storms which torment our minds. Those who suffer from epilepsy know that a fit is coming on if their extremities become cold, their sight fails, their sinews tremble, their memory deserts them, and their head swims. They, accordingly, check the growing disorder by applying the usual remedies. They try to prevent the loss of their senses by smelling or tasting some drug. They battle against cold and stiffness of limbs by hot fomentations. or, if all remedies fail, they retire apart and faint where no one sees them fall. It is useful for a man to understand his disease, and to break its strength before it becomes developed. Let us see what it is that especially irritates us. Some men take offence at insulting words, others at deeds. One wishes his pedigree, another his person, to be treated with respect. This man wishes to be considered especially fashionable, that man to be thought especially learned. One cannot bear pride, another bear obstinacy. One thinks it beneath him to be angry with his slaves, another is cruel at home but gentle abroad. One imagines that he is proposed for office because he is unpopular, another thinks himself insulted because he is not proposed. People do not all take offence in the same way. You ought, then, to know what your own weak point is, that you may guard it with especial care. 11. It is better not to see or to hear everything. Many causes of offence may pass by us, most of which are disregarded by the man who ignores them. Would you be not irascible? Then be not inquisitive. He who seeks to know what is said about him, who digs up spiteful tales, even if they were told in secret, is himself the destroyer of his own peace of mind. Some stories may be so construed as to appear to be insults, wherefore it is best to put some aside, to laugh at others, and to pardon others. There are many ways in which anger may be checked. Most things may be turned into jest. It is said that Socrates, when he was given a box on the ear, merely said that it was a pity a man could not tell when he ought to wear his helmet out walking. It does not so much matter how an injury is done, as how it is borne, and I do not see how moderation can be hard to practice, when I know that even despots, though success and impunity combine to swell their pride, have sometimes restrained their natural ferocity. At any rate, tradition informs us that once, when a guest in his cups bitterly reproached Pisistratus, the despot of Athens, for his cruelty, many of those present offered to lay hands on the traitor, and one said one thing and one another to kindle his wrath. He bore it coolly, and replied to those who were egging him on, that he was no more angry with the man than he should be with one who ran against him blindfold. 12. A large part of mankind manufacture their own grievances, either by entertaining unfounded suspicions or by exaggerating trifles. Anger often comes to us, but we often go to it. It never ought to be sent for. Even when it falls in our way, it ought to be flung aside. No one says to himself, I myself have done, or might have done, this very thing which I am angry with another for doing. No one considers the intention of the doer, but merely the thing done. Yet we ought to think about him, and whether he did it intentionally or accidentally, under compulsion or under a mistake, whether he did it out of hatred for us or to gain something for himself, or whether he did it to please himself or to serve a friend. In some cases the age, in others the worldly fortunes of the culprit, may render it humane or advantageous to bear with him and put up with what he has done. Let us put ourselves in the place of him with whom we are angry. At present, an overweening conceit of our own importance makes us prone to anger, and we are quite willing to do to others what we cannot endure should be done to ourselves. No one will postpone his anger, yet delay is the best remedy for it, because it allows its first glow to subside, and gives time for the cloud which darkens the mind either to disperse, or at any rate to become less dense. Of these wrongs which drive you frantic, some will grow lighter after an interval, not of a day, but even of an hour. Some will vanish altogether. Even if you gain nothing by your adjournment, still what you do after it will appear to be the result of mature deliberation, not of anger. If you want to find out the truth about anything, commit the task to time. Nothing can be accurately discerned at a time of disturbance. Plato, when angry with his slave, could not prevail upon himself to wait, but straightway ordered him to take off his shirt and present his shoulders to the blows which he meant to give him with his own hand. Then, when he perceived that he was angry, he stopped the hand which he had raised in the air, and stood like one in an act to strike. Being asked by a friend who happened to come in what he was doing, he answered, "I am making an angry man expiate his crime." He retained the posture of one about to give way to passion, as if struck with astonishment at its being so degrading to a philosopher, forgetting the slave, because he had found another still more deserving of punishment. He therefore denied himself the exercise of authority over his own household, and once, being rather angry at some fault, said, "Seiosippus, will you please correct that slave with stripes, for I am in a rage." He would not strike him for the very reason for which another man would have struck him. "I am in a rage," said he. "I should beat him more than I ought. I should take more pleasure than I ought in doing so. Let not that slave fall into the power of one who is not in his own power." Can anyone wish to grant the power of revenge to an angry man, when Plato himself gave up his own right to exercise it? While you are angry, you ought not to be allowed to do anything. Why, do you ask? Because when you are angry, there is nothing that you do not wish to be allowed to do. 13. Fight hard with yourself, and if you cannot conquer anger, do not let it conquer you. You have begun to get the better of it if it does not show itself, if it is not given vent. Let us conceal its symptoms, and as far as possible, keep it secret and hidden. It will give us great trouble to do this, for it is eager to burst forth, to kindle our eyes, and to transform our face. But if we allow it to show itself in our outward appearance, it is our master. Let it rather be locked in the innermost recesses of our breast, and be borne by us, not bear us. Nay, let us replace all its symptoms by their opposites. Let us make our countenance more composed than usual, our voice milder, our step slower. Our inward thoughts gradually become influenced by our outward demeanour. With Socrates, it was a sign of anger when he lowered his voice and became sparing of speech. It was evident at such times that he was exercising restraint over himself. His friends, consequently, used to detect him acting thus, and convict him of being angry. Nor was he displeased at being charged with concealment of anger. Indeed, how could he help but being glad that many men should perceive his anger, yet that none should feel it? They would, however, have felt it, had he not granted to his friends the same right of criticizing his own conduct, which he himself assumed over theirs. How much more needful is it for us to do this? Let us beg all our best friends to give us their opinion with the greatest freedom at the very time when we can bear it least, and never to be compliant with us when we are angry. While we are in our right senses, while we are under our own control, let us call for help against so powerful an evil, and one which we regard with such unjust favour. Those who cannot carry their wine discreetly, and fear to be betrayed into some rash and insolent act, give their slaves orders to take them away from the banquet when they are drunk. Those who know by experience how unreasonable they are when sick, give orders that no one is to obey them when they are in ill health. It is best to prepare obstacles beforehand for vices which are known, and above all things, so to tranquilize our mind that it may bear the most sudden and violent shocks, either without feeling anger, or, if anger be provoked by the extent of some unexpected wrong, that it may bury it deep, and not betray its wound. That it is possible to do this will be seen if I quote a few of an abundance of examples, from which we may learn both how much evil there is in anger when it exercises entire dominion over men in supreme power, and how completely it can control itself when overawed by fear. 14. King Cambyses was excessively addicted to wine. Praesaspes was the only one of his closest friends who advised him to drink more sparingly, pointing out how shameful a thing drunkenness was in a king, upon whom all eyes and ears were fixed. Cambyses answered, "That you may know that I never lose command of myself, I will presently prove to you that both my eyes and my hands are fit for service after I have been drinking." Hereupon he drank more freely than usual, using larger cups, and, when heavy and besotted with wine, ordered his reprover's son to go beyond the threshold and stand there with his left hand raised above his head. Then he bent his bow and pierced the youth's heart, at which he had said that he aimed. He then had his breast cut open, showed the arrow sticking exactly into the heart, and, looking at the boy's father, risked whether his hand was not steady enough. He replied that Apollo himself could not have taken better aim. God confound such a man, a slave in mind if not in station. He actually praised an act which he ought not to have endured to witness. He thought that the breast of his son being torn asunder, and his heart quivering with its wound, gave him an opportunity of making a complimentary speech. He ought to have raised a dispute with him about his success, and have called for another shot, that the king might be pleased to prove upon the person of the father that his hand was even steadier than when he shot the son. What a savage king! What a worthy mark for all his followers' arrows! Yet though we curse him for making his banquet end in cruelty and death, still it was worse to praise that arrow shot than to shoot it. We shall see hereafter how a father ought to bear himself when standing over the corpse of his son, whose murder he had both caused and witnessed. The matter which we are now discussing has been proved. I mean, that anger can be suppressed. He did not curse the king. He did not so much as let fall a single inauspicious word, though he felt his own heart as deeply wounded as that of his son. He may be said to have done well in choking down his words, for though he might have spoken as an angry man, yet he could not have expressed what he felt as a father. He may, I repeat, be thought to have behaved with greater wisdom on that occasion than when he tried to regulate the drink of one who was better employed in drinking wine than in drinking blood, and who granted men peace while his hands were busy with the wine-cup. He, therefore, added one more to the number of those who have shown to their bitter cost how little kings care for their friends' good advice. 15. I have no doubt that Harpagus must have given some such advice to the king of the Persians, and of himself, in anger of which the king placed Harpagus's own children before him on the dinner-table for him to eat, and asked him from time to time whether he liked the seasoning. Then, when he saw that he was satiated with his own misery, he ordered their heads to be brought to him, and asked him how he liked his entertainment. The wretched man did not lose his readiness of speech, his face did not change. Every kind of dinner, he said, is pleasant at the king's table. What did he gain by this obsequiousness? He avoided being invited a second time to dinner, to eat what was left of them. I do not forbid a father to blame the act of his king, or to seek for some revenge worthy of so bloodthirsty a monster. But in the meanwhile, I gather from the tale this fact, that even the anger which arises from unheard-of outrages can be concealed, and forced into using language which is the very reverse of its meaning. This way of curbing anger is necessary, at least for those who have chosen this sort of life, and who are admitted to dine at a king's table. This is how they must eat and drink, this is how they must answer, and how they must laugh at their own deaths. Whether life is worth having at such a price, we shall see hereafter. That is another question. Let us not console so sorry a crew, or encourage them to submit to the orders of their butchers. Let us point out that however slavish a man's condition may be, there is always a path to liberty open to him, unless his mind be diseased. It is a man's own fault if he suffers, when by putting an end to himself he can put an end to misery. To him whose king aimed arrows at the breasts of his friends, and to him whose master gorged fathers with the hearts of their children, I would say, Madman, why do you groan? For what are you waiting? For some enemy to avenge you by the destruction of your entire nation? Or for some powerful king to arrive from a distant land? Wherever you turn your eyes, you may see an end to your woes. Do you see that precipice? Down that lies the road to liberty. Do you see that sea, that river, that well? Liberty sits at the bottom of them. Do you see that tree, stunted, blighted, dried up though it be, yet liberty hangs from its branches? Do you see your own throat, your own neck, your own heart? They are so many ways of escape from slavery. Are these modes which I point out too laborious, and needing much strength and courage? Do you ask what path leads to liberty? I answer, any vein in your body. 16. As long, however, as we find nothing in our life so unbearable as to drive us to suicide, let us, in whatever position we may be, set anger far from us. It is destructive to those who are its slaves. All its rage turns to its own misery, and authority becomes all the more irksome the more obstinately it is resisted. It is like a wild animal whose struggles only pull the noose by which it is caught tighter, or like birds who, while flurriedly trying to shake themselves free, smear birdlime onto all their feathers. No yoke is so grievous as not to hurt him who struggles against it more than him who yields to it. The only way to alleviate great evils is to endure them, and to submit to do what they compel. This control of our passions, and especially of this mad and unbridled passion of anger, is useful to subjects, but still more useful to kings. All is lost when a man's position enables him to carry out whatever anger prompts him to do. Nor can power long endure if it be exercised to the injury of many, for it becomes endangered as soon as common fear draws together those who bewail themselves separately. Many kings, therefore, have fallen victims, some to single individuals, others to entire peoples, who have been forced by general indignation to make one man the minister of their wrath. Yet many kings have indulged their anger as though it were a privilege of royalty, like Darius, who, after the dethronement of the Magian, was the first ruler of the Persians and of the greater part of the East. For when he declared war against the Scythians who bordered on the empire of the East, Iobazus, an aged noble, begged that one of his 3 sons might be left at home to comfort his father, and that the king might be satisfied with the services of 2 of them. Darius promised him more than he asked for, saying that he would allow all 3 to remain at home, and flung their dead bodies before their father's eyes. He would have been harsh had he taken them all to the war with him. How much more good-natured was Xerxes, who, when Pythias, the father of 5 sons, begged for one to be excused from service, permitted him to choose which he wished for. He then tore the son whom the father had chosen into 2 halves, placed one on each side of the road, and, as it were, purified his armies by means of this propitiatory victim. He therefore had the end which he deserved, being defeated and his armies scattered far and wide in utter rout, while he in the midst of it walked among the corpses of his soldiers, seeing on all sides the signs of his own overthrow. 17. So ferocious in their anger were those kings, who had no learning, no tincture of polite literature. Now I will show you King Alexander the Great, fresh from the lap of Aristotle, who with his own hand, while at table, stabbed Clytus, his dearest friend, who had been brought up with him, because he did not flatter him enough, and was too slow in transforming himself from a freeman and a Macedonian into a Persian slave. Indeed, he shut up Lysimachus, who was no less a friend than Clytus, in a cage with a lion. Yet did this make Lysimachus, who escaped by some happy chance from the lion's teeth, any gentler when he became a king. Why, he mutilated his own friend, Telesphorus the Rhodian, cutting off his nose and ears, and kept him for a long while in a den, like some new and strange animal, after the hideousness of his hacked and disfigured face had made him no longer appear to be human, assisted by starvation and the squalid filth of a body left to wallow in its own dung. Besides this, his hands and knees, which the narrowness of his abode forced him to use instead of his feet, became hard and callous, while his sides were covered with sores by rubbing against the walls, so that his appearance was no less shocking than frightful, and his punishment turned him into so monstrous a creature that he was not even pitied. Yet, however unlike a man he was who suffered this, even more unlike was he who inflicted it. 18. Would to heaven that such savagery had contented itself with foreign examples, and that barbarity in anger and punishment had not been imported with other outlandish vices into our Roman manners. Marcus Marius, to whom the people erected a statue in every street, to whom they made offerings of incense and wine, had, by the command of Lucius Sulla, his legs broken, his eyes pulled out, his hands cut off, and his whole body gradually torn to pieces, limb by limb, as if Sulla killed him as many times as he wounded him. Who was it that carried out Sulla's orders? Who but Catiline, already practising his hands in every sort of wickedness? He tore him to pieces before the tomb of Quintus Catulus, an unwelcome burden to the ashes of that gentlest of men, above which one who was no doubt a criminal, yet nevertheless the idol of the people, and who was not undeserving of love, although men loved him beyond all reason, was forced to shed his blood drop by drop. Though Marius deserved such tortures, yet it was worthy of Sulla to order them, and of Catiline to execute them. But it was unworthy of the state to be stabbed by the swords of her enemy and her avenger alike. Why do I pry into ancient history? Quite lately, Gaius Caesar flogged and tortured Sextus Papinius, whose father was a consular, Batilianus Bassus, and his own questor, and several others, both senators and knights, on the same day, not to carry out any judicial inquiry, but merely to amuse himself. Indeed, so impatient was he of any delay in receiving the pleasure which his monstrous cruelty never delayed in asking, that when walking with some ladies and senators in his mother's gardens, along the walk between the colonnade and the river, he struck off some of their heads by lamplight. What did he fear? What public or private danger could one night threaten him with? How very small a favour it would have been to wait until morning, and not to kill the Roman people's senators in his slippers. 19. It is to the purpose that we should know how haughtily his cruelty was exercised, although someone might suppose that we are wandering from the subject and embarking on a digression. But this digression is itself connected with unusual outbursts of anger. He beat senators with rods. He did it so often that he made men able to say, "It is the custom." He tortured them with all the most dismal engines in the world, with the cord, the boots, the rack, the fire, and the sight of his own face. Even to this we may answer, to tear 3 senators to pieces with stripes and fire, like criminal slaves, was no such great crime for one who had thoughts of butchering the entire Senate, who was wont to wish that the Roman people had but one neck, that he might concentrate into one day and one blow all the wickedness which he divided among so many places and times. Was there ever anything so unheard of as an execution in the night time? Highway robbery seeks for the shelter of darkness, but the more public an execution is, the more power it has as an example and lesson. Here I shall be met by, "This which you are so surprised at was the daily habit of that monster. This was what he lived for, watched for, sat up at night for." Certainly one could find no one else who would have ordered all those whom he condemned to death to have their mouths closed by a sponge being fastened in them, that they might not have the power even of uttering a sound. What dying man was ever forbidden to groan? He feared that the last agony might find too free a voice, that he might hear what would displease him. He knew, moreover, that there were countless crimes with which none but a dying man would dare to reproach him. When sponges were not forthcoming, he ordered the wretched men's clothes to be torn up, the rags stuffed into their mouths. What savagery was this? Let a man draw his last breath, give room for his soul to escape through. Let it not be forced to leave the body through a wound. It becomes tedious to add to this that in the same night he sent centurions to the houses of the executed men, and made an end of their fathers also. That is to say, being a compassionate-minded man, he set them free from sorrow. For it is not my intention to describe the ferocity of Gaius, but the ferocity of anger, which does not merely vent its rage upon individuals, but rends in pieces whole nations, and even lashes cities, rivers, and things which have no sense of pain. 20. Thus the king of the Persians cut off the noses of a whole nation in Syria, wherefore the place is called Rhinocolura. Do you think that he was merciful because he did not cut off their heads altogether? No, he was delighted at having invented a new kind of punishment. Something of the same kind would have befallen the Ethiopians, who, on account of their prodigiously long lives, are called macrobiote. For, because they did not receive slavery with hands uplifted to heaven in thankfulness, and sent an embassy which used independent, or what kings call insulting, language, Cambyses became wild with rage, and, without any store of provisions, or any knowledge of the roads, started with all his fighting men through an arid and trackless waste, where during the first day's march the necessaries of life failed, and the country itself furnished nothing, being barren and uncultivated, and untrodden by the foot of man. At first the tenderest parts of leaves and shoots of trees relieved their hunger, then hides softened by fire, and anything else that their extremity drove them to use as food. When, as they proceeded, neither roots nor herbs were to be found in the sand, and they found a wilderness destitute even of animal life, they chose each 10th man by lot, and made of him a meal which was more cruel than hunger. Rage still drove the king madly forwards, until after he had lost one part of his army and eaten another, he began to fear that he also might be called upon to draw the lot for his life. Then at last he gave the order to retreat. Yet all the while his well-bred hawks were not sacrificed, and the means of feasting were carried for him on camels, while his soldiers were drawing lots for who should miserably perish, and who should yet more miserably live. 21. This man was angry with an unknown and inoffensive nation, which nevertheless was able to feel his wrath. But Cyrus was angry with a river. When hurrying to besiege Babylon, since in making war it is above all things important to seize one's opportunity, he tried to ford the widespread river Gindis, which is hardly safe to attempt even when the river has been dried up by the summer heat and is at its lowest. Here, one of the white horses which drew the royal chariot was washed away, and his loss moved the king to such violent rage that he swore to reduce the river which had carried off his royal retinue to so low an ebb that even women should walk across it and trample upon it. He thereupon devoted all the resources of his army to this object, and remained working until, by cutting 180 channels across the bed of the river, he divided it into 360 brooks, and left the bed dry, the waters flowing through other channels. Thus he lost time, which is very important in great operations, and lost also the soldier's courage, which was broken by useless labour, and the opportunity of falling upon his enemy unprepared, while he was waging against the river the war which he had declared against his foes. This frenzy, for what else can you call it, has befallen Romans also, for Gaius Caesar destroyed a most beautiful villa at Herculaneum because his mother was once imprisoned in it, and has thus made the place notorious by its misfortune. For while it stood, we used to sail past it without noticing it, but now people inquire why it is in ruins. 22. These should be regarded as examples to be avoided, and what I am about to relate, on the contrary, to be followed, being examples of gentle and lenient conduct in men who both had reasons for anger and power to avenge themselves. What could have been easier than for Antigonus to order those 2 common soldiers to be executed, who leaned against their king's tent while doing what all men especially love to do, and run the greatest danger by doing, I mean while they spoke evil of their king? Antigonus heard all they said, as was likely, since there was only a piece of cloth between the speakers and the listener, who gently raised it, and said, "Go a little further off, for fear the king should hear you." He also, on one night, hearing some of his soldiers invoking everything that was evil upon their king, for having brought them along that road and into that impassable mud, went to those who were in the greatest difficulties, and having extricated them without their knowing who was their helper, said, "Now curse Antigonus, by whose fault you have fallen into this trouble, but bless the man who has brought you out of this slough." The same Antigonus bore the abuse of his enemies as good-naturedly as those of his countrymen. Thus, when he was besieging some Greeks in a little fort, and they, despising their enemy through their confidence in the strength of their position, cut many jokes upon the ugliness of Antigonus, at one time mocking him for his shortness of stature, at another for his broken nose, he answered, "I rejoice and expect some good fortune, because I have a Silenus in my camp." After he had conquered these witty folk by hunger, his treatment of them was to form regiments of those who were fit for service, and sell the rest by public auction. Nor would he, said he, have done this, had it not been better that men who had such evil tongues should be under the control of a master. 23. This man's grandson was Alexander, who used to hurl his lance at his guests, who, of the 2 friends which I have mentioned above, exposed one to the rage of a wild beast, and the other to his own. Yet of these 2 men, he who was exposed to the lion survived. He did not derive this vice from his grandfather, nor even from his father, for it was an especial virtue of Philip's to endure insults patiently, and was a great safeguard of his kingdom. Demochares, who was surnamed Parrhesiastes on account of his unbridled and impudent tongue, came on an embassy to him with other ambassadors from Athens. After graciously listening to what they had to say, Philip said to them, "Tell me, what can I do that will please the Athenians?" Demochares took him up and answered, "Hang yourself." All the bystanders expressed their indignation at so brutal an answer, but Philip bade them be silent, and let this Thersites depart safe and sound. "But do you," said he, "you other ambassadors, tell the Athenians that those who say such things are more arrogant than those who hear them without revenging themselves." The late Emperor Augustus also did and said many memorable things, which prove that he was not under the dominion of anger. Timagenes, the historical writer, made some remarks upon him, his wife, and his whole family, nor did his jests fall to the ground, for nothing spreads more widely or is more in people's mouths than reckless wit. Caesar often warned him to be less audacious in his talk, and as he continued to offend, forbade him his house. Timagenes, after this, passed the later years of his life as the guest of Asinius Pollio, and was the favourite of the whole city. The closing of Caesar's door did not close any other door against him. He read aloud the history which he wrote after this, but burned the books which contained the doings of Augustus Caesar. He was at enmity with Caesar, but yet no one feared to be his friend. No one shrank from him as though he were blasted by lightning. Although he fell from so high a place, yet someone was found to catch him in his lap. Caesar, I say, bore this with patience, and was not even irritated by the historians having laid violent hands upon his own glories and acts. He never complained of the man who afforded his enemy shelter, but merely said to Asinius Pollio, "You are keeping a wild beast." Then, when the other would have excused his conduct, he stopped him and said, "Enjoy my Pollio, enjoy his friendship." When Pollio said, "If you order me, Caesar, I will straightway forbid him my house," he answered, "Do you think that I am likely to do this, after having made you friends again?" For formerly Pollio had been angry with Timagenes, and ceased to be angry with him for no other reason than that Caesar began to be so. 24. Let everyone, then, say to himself whenever he is provoked, "Am I more powerful than Philip? Yet he allowed a man to curse him with impunity. Have I more authority in my own house than the Emperor Augustus possessed throughout the world? Yet he was satisfied with leaving the society of his maligner. Why should I make my slave atone by stripes and manacles for having answered me too loudly, or having put on a stubborn look, or muttered something which I did not catch? Who am I that it should be a crime to shock my ears? Many men have forgiven their enemies. Shall I not forgive men for being lazy, careless, and gossiping? We ought to plead age as an excuse for children, sex for women, freedom for a stranger, familiarity for a house servant. Is this his first offence? Think how long he has been acceptable. Has he often done wrong, and in many cases? Then let us continue to bear what we have borne so long. Is he a friend? Then he did not intend to do it. Is he an enemy? Then in doing it he did his duty. If he be a sensible man, let us believe his excuses. If a fool, let us grant him pardon. Whatever he may be, let us say to ourselves on his behalf that even the wisest of men are often in fault, that no one is so alert that his carefulness never betrays itself, that no one is of so ripe a judgment that his serious mind cannot be goaded by circumstances into some hot-headed action, that, in fine, no one, however much he may fear to give offence, can help doing so, even while he tries to avoid it. 25. As it is a consolation to a humble man in trouble that the greatest are subject to reverses of fortune, and a man weeps more calmly over his dead son in the corner of his hovel if he sees a piteous funeral proceed out of the palace as well, so one bears injury or insult more calmly if one remembers that no power is so great as to be above the reach of harm. Indeed, if even the wisest do wrong, who cannot plead a good excuse for his faults? Let us look back upon our own youth, and think how often we were too slothful in our duty, too impudent in our speech, too intemperate in our cups. Is anyone angry? Then let us give him enough time to reflect upon what he has done, and he will correct his own self. But suppose he ought to pay the penalty of his deeds. Well, that is no reason why we should act as he does. It cannot be doubted that he who regards his tormentor with contempt raises himself above the common herd and looks down upon them from a loftier position. It is the property of true magnanimity not to feel the blows which it may receive. So does a huge wild beast turn slowly and gaze at yelping curs. So does the wave dash in vain against a great cliff. The man who is not angry remains unshaken by injury. He who is angry has been moved by it. He, however, whom I have described as being placed too high for any mischief to reach him, holds, as it were, the highest good in his arms. He can reply not only to any man, but to fortune herself, "Do what you will, you are too feeble to disturb my serenity. This is forbidden by reason, to whom I have entrusted the guidance of my life. To become angry would do me more harm than your violence can do me." More harm, you say? Yes, certainly. I know how much injury you have done me, but I cannot tell to what excesses anger might not carry me. 26. You say, "I cannot endure it. Injuries are hard to bear." You lie, for how can anyone not be able to bear injury if he can bear to be angry? Besides, what you intend to do is to endure both injury and anger. Why do you bear with the delirium of a sick man, or the ravings of a madman, or the impudent blows of a child? Because, of course, they evidently do not know what they are doing. A man be not responsible for his actions. What does it matter by what malady he became so? The plea of ignorance holds equally good in every case. What then, say you, shall he not be punished? He will be, even supposing that you do not wish it. For the greatest punishment for having done harm is the sense of having done it, and no one is more severely punished than he who is given over to the punishment of remorse. In the next place, we ought to consider the whole state of mankind, in order to pass a judgment on all the occurrences of life. For it is unjust to blame individuals for a vice which is common to all. The colour of an Ethiop is not remarkable among his own people, nor is any man in Germany ashamed of red hair rolled into a knot. You cannot call anything peculiar or disgraceful in a particular man if it is the general characteristic of his nation. Now, the cases which I have quoted are defended only by the usage of one out-of-the-way quarter of the world. See now how far more deserving of pardon those crimes are which are spread abroad among all mankind. We all are hasty and careless. We all are untrustworthy, dissatisfied, and ambitious. Nay, why do I try to hide our common wickedness by a too partial description? We all are bad. Every one of us, therefore, will find in his own breast the vice which he blames in another. Why do you remark how pale this man, or how lean that man is? There is a general pestilence. Let us, therefore, be more gentle one to another. We are bad men, living among bad men. There is only one thing which can afford us peace, and that is to agree to forgive one another. This man has already injured me, say you, and I have not yet injured him. No, but you have probably injured someone else, and you will injure him some day. Do not form your judgment by 1 hour or 1 day. consider the whole tendency of your mind. Even though you have done no evil, yet you are capable of doing it. 27. How far better is it to heal an injury than to avenge it? Revenge takes up much time, and throws itself in the way of many injuries while it is smarting under one. We all retain our anger longer than we feel our hurt. How far better it were to take the opposite course, and not meet one mischief by another. Would anyone think himself to be in his perfect mind if he were to return kicks to a mule or bites to a dog? These creatures, you say, know not what they are doing. Then, in the first place, what an unjust judge you must be if a man has less chance of gaining your forgiveness than a beast. Secondly, if animals are protected from your anger by their want of reason, you ought to treat all foolish men in the like manner. For if a man has that mental darkness which excuses all the wrongdoings of dumb animals, what difference does it make if in other respects he be unlike a dumb animal? He has sinned. Well, is this the first time, or will this be the last time? Why, you should not believe him even if he said, "Never will I do so again." He will sin, and another will sin against him, and all his life he will wallow in wickedness. Savagery must be met by kindness. We ought to use to a man in anger the argument which is so effective with one in grief. That is, shall you leave off this at some time, or never? If you will do so at some time, how better it is that you should abandon anger than that anger should abandon you. Or, will this excitement never leave you? Do you see what an unquiet life you condemn yourself? For what will be the life of one who is always swelling with rage? Add to this that after you have worked yourself up into a rage, and have from time to time renewed the cranes of your excitement, yet your anger will depart from you of its own accord, and time will sap its strength. How much better then is it that it should be overcome by you than by itself? 28. If you are angry, you will quarrel first with this man and then with that, first with slaves and then with freedmen, first with parents, then with children, first with acquaintances, then with strangers. For there are grounds for anger in every case. Unless your mind steps in and intercedes with you, your frenzy will drag you from one place to another, and from thence to elsewhere. Your madness will constantly meet with newly occurring irritants, and will never depart from you. Tell me, miserable man, what time you will have for loving. Oh, what good time you are wasting on an evil thing. How much better it would be to win friends and disarm enemies, to serve the state, or to busy oneself with one's private affairs, rather than to cast about for what harm you can do to somebody, what wound you can inflict, either upon his social position, his fortune, or his person, although you cannot succeed in doing so without a struggle and risk to yourself, even if your antagonist be inferior to you. Even supposing that he were handed over to you in chains, and that you were at liberty to torture him as much as you please, yet even then excessive violence in striking a blow often causes us to dislocate a joint, or entangles a sinew in the teeth which it has broken. Anger makes many men cripples or invalids, even when it meets with an unresisting victim. And besides this, no creature is so weak that it can be destroyed without any danger to its destroyer. Sometimes grief, sometimes chance, puts the weakest on a level with the strongest. What shall we say of the fact that the greater part of the things which enrage us are insults, not injuries? It makes a great difference whether a man thwarts my wishes, or merely fails to carry them out, whether he robs me, or does not give me anything. Yet we count it all the same, whether a man takes anything from us, or refuses to give anything to us, whether he extinguishes our hope or defers it, whether his object be to hinder us or to help himself, whether he acts out of love for someone or out of hatred for us. Some men are bound to oppose us, not only on the ground of justice, but of honour. One is defending his father, another his brother, another his country, another his friend. Yet we do not forgive men for doing what we should blame them for not doing. Nay, though one can hardly believe it, we often think well of an act, and ill of the man who did it. But, by Hercules, a great and just man looks with respect at the bravest of his enemies, and the most obstinate defender of his freedom and his country, and wishes that he had such a man for his own countryman and soldier. 29. It is shameful to hate him whom you praise, but how much more shameful is it to hate a man for something for which he deserves to be pitied? If a prisoner of war who has suddenly been reduced to the condition of a slave still retains some remnants of liberty, and does not run nimbly to perform foul and toilsome tasks, if, having grown slothful by long rest, he cannot run fast enough to keep pace with his master's horse or carriage, if sleep overpowers him when weary with many days and nights of watching, if he refuses to undertake farm work, or does not do it heartily when brought away from the idleness of city service and put to hard labour, we ought to make a distinction between whether a man cannot or will not do it. We should pardon many slaves if we began to judge them before we began to be angry with them. As it is, however, we obey our first impulse, and then, although we may prove to have been excited about mere trifles, yet we continue to be angry, lest we should seem to have begun to be angry without cause, and, most unjust of all, the injustice of our anger makes us persist in it all the more, for we nurse it and inflame it as though to be violently angry proved our anger to be just. 30. How much better is it to observe how trifling, how inoffensive are the first beginnings of anger? You will see that men are subject to the same influences as dumb animals. We are put out by trumpery, futile matters. Bulls are excited by red colour. The asp raises its head at a shadow. Bears or lions are irritated at the shaking of a rag, and all creatures who are naturally fierce and wild are alarmed at trifles. The same thing befalls men both of restless and of sluggish disposition. They are seized by suspicions, sometimes to such an extent that they call slight benefits injuries, and these form the most common and certainly the most bitter subject for anger. For we become angry with our dearest friends for having bestowed less upon us than we expected, and less than others have received from them. Yet there is a remedy at hand for both these grievances. Has he favoured our rival more than ourselves? Then let us enjoy what we have without making comparisons. A man will never be well off to whom it is a torture to see anyone better off than himself. Have I less than I hoped for? Well, perhaps I hoped for more than I ought. This it is against which we ought to be especially on our guard. From hence arises the most destructive anger, sparing nothing, not even the holiest. The Emperor Julius was not stabbed by so many enemies as by friends whose insatiable hopes he had not satisfied. He was willing enough to do so, for no one ever made a more generous use of victory, of whose fruits he kept nothing for himself, save the power of distributing them. But how could he glut such unconscionable appetites, when each man coveted as much as any one man could possess? This was why he saw his fellow soldiers standing round his chair with drawn swords. Tilius Cimber, though he had a short time before been the keenest defender of his party, and others who only became Pompeians after Pompeius was dead. This it is which has turned the arms of kings against them, and made their trustiest followers meditate the death of him for whom and before whom they once would have been glad to die. 31. No man is satisfied with his own lot if he fixes his attention on that of another, and this leads to our being angry even with the gods, because somebody precedes us, though we forget of how many people we take precedence, and that when a man envies few people, he must be followed in the background by a huge crowd of people who envy him. Yet so churlish is human nature that, however much men may have received, they think themselves wronged if they are able to receive still more. He gave me the praetorship, yes, but I had hoped for the consulship. He bestowed the 12 axes upon me, true, but he did not make me a regular consul. He allowed me to give my name to the year, but he did not help me to the priesthood. I have been elected a member of the college, but why only of one? He has bestowed upon me every honour that the state affords, yes, but he has added nothing to my private fortune. What he gave me he was obliged to give somebody. He brought out nothing from his own pocket. Rather than speak thus, thank him for what you have received. Wait for the rest, and be thankful that you are not yet too full to contain more. There is a pleasure in having something left to hope for. Are you preferred to everyone? Then rejoice at holding the first place in the thoughts of your friend. Or are many others preferred before you? Then think how many more are below you than there are above you. Do you ask what is your greatest fault? It is that you keep your accounts wrongly. You set a high value upon what you give, and a low one upon what you receive. 32. Let different qualities in different people keep us from quarrelling with them. Let us fear to be angry with some, feel ashamed of being angry with others, and disdain to be angry with others. We do a fine thing indeed when we send a wretched slave to the workhouse. Why are we in such a hurry to flog him at once, to break his legs straightway? We shall not lose our boasted power if we defer its exercise. Let us wait for the time when we ourselves can give orders. At present, we speak under constraint from anger. When it has passed away, we shall see what amount of damage has been done. For this is what we are especially liable to make mistakes about. We use the sword and capital punishment, and we appoint chains, imprisonment, and starvation to punish a crime which deserves only flogging with a light scourge. In what way, you say, do you bid us look at those things by which we think ourselves injured, that we may see how paltry, pitiful, and childish they are? Of all things I would charge you to take to yourself a magnanimous spirit, and behold how low and sordid all these matters are, about which we squabble and run to and fro till we are out of breath. To anyone who entertains any lofty and magnificent ideas, they are not worthy of a thought. 33. The greatest hullabaloo is about money. This it is which wearies out the law courts, sows strife between father and son, concocts poisons, and gives swords to murderers just as to soldiers. It is stained with our blood. On account of it, husbands and wives wrangle all night long. Crowds press round the bench of magistrates. Kings rage and plunder, and overthrow communities which it has taken the labour of centuries to build, that they may seek for gold and silver in the ashes of their cities. Do you like to look at your money bags lying in the corner? It is for these that men shout till their eyes start from their heads, that the law courts ring with the din of trials, and that jurymen brought from the greatest distances sit to decide which man's covetousness is the more equitable. What shall we say if it be not even for a bag of money, but for a handful of coppers, or a shilling scored up by a slave, that some old man, soon to die without an heir, bursts with rage? What if it be an invalid moneylender, whose feet are distorted by the gout, and who can no longer use his hands to count with, who calls for his interest on 1,000th a month, and by his sureties demands his pence even during the paroxysms of his disease? If you were to bring me all the money from all our mines, which we are at this moment sinking, if you were to bring tonight all that is concealed in hoards, where avarice returns money to the earth from whence it came, and pity that it was ever dug out, all that mass I should not think worthy to cause a wrinkle on the brow of a good man. What ridicule those things deserve which bring tears into our eyes. 34. Come now, let us enumerate the other causes of anger. They are food, drink, and the showy apparatus connected with them, words, insults, disrespectful movements of the body, suspicions, obstinate cattle, lazy slaves, and spiteful construction put upon other men's words, so that even the gift of language to mankind becomes reckoned among the wrongs of nature. Believe me, the things which cause us great heat are trifles, the sort of things that children fight and squabble over. There is nothing serious, nothing important in all that we do with such gloomy faces. It is, I repeat, the setting a great value on trifles that is the cause of your anger and madness. This man wanted to rob me of my inheritance. That one has brought a charge against me before persons whom I had long courted with great expectations. That one has coveted my mistress. A wish for the same things, which ought to have been a bond of friendship, becomes a source of quarrels and hatred. A narrow path causes quarrels among those who pass up and down it. A wide and broadly spread road may be used by whole tribes without jostling. Those objects of desire of yours cause strife and disputes among those who covet the same things, because they are petty, and cannot be given to one man without being taken away from another. 35. You are indignant at being answered back by your slave, your freedman, your wife, or your client, and then you complain of the state having lost the freedom which you have destroyed in your own house. Then again, if he is silent when you question him, you call it sullen obstinacy. Let him both speak and be silent, and laugh too. In the presence of his master, you ask? Nay, say rather, in the presence of the house-father. Why do you shout? Why do you storm? Why do you, in the middle of dinner, call for a whip? Because the slaves are talking? Because a crowd as large as a public meeting is not as silent as the wilderness? You have ears, not merely that you may listen to musical sounds, softly and sweetly drawn out and harmonized. You ought to hear laughter and weeping, coaxing and quarrelling, joy and sorrow, the human voice and the roaring and barking of animals. Miserable one, why do you shudder at the noise of a slave, at the rattling of brass or the banging of a door? You cannot help hearing the thunder, however refined you may be. You may apply these remarks about your ears with equal truth to your eyes, which are just as dainty if they have been badly schooled. They are shocked at stains and dirt, at silver plate which is not sufficiently bright, or at a pool whose water is not clear down to the bottom. Those same eyes which can only endure to see the most variegated marble, and that which has just been scoured bright, which will look at no table whose wood is not marked with a network of veining, and which at home are loath to tread upon anything that is not more precious than gold, will, when out of doors, gaze most calmly upon rough and miry paths, will see unmoved that the greater number of persons that meet them are shabbily dressed, and that the walls of the houses are rotten, full of cracks and uneven. What, then, can be the reason that they are not distressed out of doors by sights which would shock them in their own home, unless it be that their temper is placid and long-suffering in one case, sulky and fault-finding in the other? 36. All our senses should be educated into strength. They are naturally able to endure much, provided that the spirit forbears to spoil them. The spirit ought to be brought up for daily examination. It was the custom of Sextius, when the day was over, and he had betaken himself to rest, to inquire of his spirit, "What bad habit of yours have you cured today? What vice have you checked? In what respect are you better?" Anger will cease and become more gentle, if it knows that every day it will have to appear before the judgment seat. What can be more admirable than this fashion of discussing the whole of the day's events? How sweet is the sleep which follows this self-examination! How calm, how sound and careless is it, when our spirit has either received praise or reprimand, and when our secret inquisitor and censor has made his report about our morals. I make use of this privilege, and daily plead my cause before myself. When the lamp is taken out of my sight, and my wife, who knows my habit, has ceased to talk, I pass the whole day in review before myself, and repeat all that I have said and done. I conceal nothing from myself, and omit nothing. For why should I be afraid of any of my shortcomings, when it is in my power to say, "I pardon you this time, see that you never do that any more. In that dispute you spoke too contentiously. Do not, for the future, argue with ignorant people. Those who have never been taught are unwilling to learn. You reprimanded that man with more freedom than you ought, and consequently you have offended him instead of amending his ways. In dealing with other cases of the kind, you should look carefully, not only to the truth of what you say, but also whether the person to whom you speak can bear to be told the truth. A good man delights in receiving advice. All the worst men are the most impatient of guidance. 37. At the dinner table, some jokes and sayings intended to give you pain have been directed against you. Avoid feasting with low people. Those who are not modest even when sober become much more recklessly impudent after drinking. You have seen your friend in a rage with the porter of some lawyer or rich man, because he has sent him back when about to enter, and you yourself, on behalf of your friend, have been in a rage with the meanest of slaves. Would you then be angry with a chained house-dog? Why, even he, after a long bout of barking, becomes gentle if you offer him food. So draw back and smile. For the moment, your porter fancies himself to be somebody, because he guards a door which is beset by a crowd of litigants. For the moment, he who sits within is prosperous and happy, and thinks that a street door through which it is hard to gain entrance is the mark of a rich and powerful man. He knows not that the hardest door of all to open is that of the prison. Be prepared to submit to much. Is anyone surprised at being cold in winter, at being sick at sea, or at being jostled in the street? The mind is strong enough to bear those evils for which it is prepared. When you are not given a sufficiently distinguished place at table, you have begun to be angry with your fellow guests, with your host, and with him who is preferred above you. Idiot! What difference can it make what part of the couch you rest upon? Can a cushion give you honour, or take it away? You have looked askance at somebody because he has spoken slightingly of your talents. Will you apply this rule to yourself? If so, Ennius, whose poetry you do not care for, would have hated you. Hortensius, if you had found fault with his speeches, would have quarrelled with you, and Cicero, if you had laughed at his poetry, would have been your enemy. A candidate for office, will you resent men's votes? 38. Someone has offered you an insult. Not a greater one, probably, than was offered to the Stoic philosopher Diogenes, in whose face an insolent young man spat just when he was lecturing upon anger. He bore it mildly and wisely. "I am not angry," he said, "but I am not sure that I ought not to be angry." Yet how much better did our Cato behave, when he was pleading one Lentulus, whom our fathers remember as a demagogue and passionate man, spat all the phlegm he could muster upon his forehead. Cato wiped his face, and said, "Lentulus, I shall declare to all the world that men are mistaken when they say that you are wanting in cheek." 39. We have now succeeded, my Novatus, in properly regulating our own minds. They either do not feel anger, or are above it. Let us next see how we may soothe the wrath of others, for we do not only wish to be whole, but to heal. You should not attempt to allay the first burst of anger by words. It is deaf and frantic. We must give it scope. Our remedies will only be effective when it slackens. We do not meddle with men's eyes when they are swollen, because we should only irritate their hard stiffness by touching them. Nor do we try to cure other diseases when at their height. The best treatment in the first stage of illness is rest. Of how very little value, you say, is your remedy, if it appeases anger which is subsiding of its own accord? In the first place, I answer, it makes it end quicker. In the next, it prevents a relapse. It can render harmless even the violent impulse which it dares not soothe. It will put out of the way all weapons which might be used for revenge. It will pretend to be angry, in order that its advice may have more weight as coming from an assistant and comrade in grief. It will invent delays, and postpone immediate punishment while a greater one is being sought for. It will use every artifice to give the man a respite from his frenzy. If his anger be unusually strong, it will inspire him with some irresistible feeling of shame or of fear. If weak, it will make use of conversation on amusing or novel subjects, and by playing upon his curiosity, lead him to forget his passion. We are told that a physician who was forced to cure the king's daughter, and could not without using the knife, conveyed a lancet to her swollen breast, concealed under the sponge with which he was fermenting it. The same girl, who would have shrunk from the remedy if he had applied it openly, bore the pain because she did not expect it. Some diseases can only be cured by deceit. 40. To one class of men you will say, "Beware lest your anger give pleasure to your foes." To the other, "Beware lest your greatness of mind and the reputation it bears among most people for strength become impaired. I myself, by Hercules, am scandalized at your treatment, and am grieved beyond measure, but we must wait for a proper opportunity. He shall pay for what he has done, be well assured of that. When you are able, you shall return it to him with interest." To reprove a man when he is angry is to add to his anger by being angry oneself. You should approach him in different ways and in a compliant fashion, unless, perchance, you be so great a personage that you can quash his anger, as the Emperor Augustus did when he was dining with Vedius Pollio. One of the slaves had broken a crystal goblet of his. Vedius ordered him to be led away to die, and that too in no common fashion. He ordered him to be thrown to feed the Mureni, some of which fish, of great size, he kept in a tank. Who would not think that he did this out of luxury? But it was out of cruelty. The boy slipped through the hands of those who tried to seize him, and flung himself at Caesar's feet in order to beg for nothing more than that he might die in some different way and not be eaten. Caesar was shocked at this novel form of cruelty, and ordered him be let go, and, in his place, all the crystalware which he saw before him to be broken, and the tank to be filled up. This was the proper way for Caesar to reprove his friend. He made a good use of his power. What are you, that when at dinner you order men to be put to death, and mangled by an unheard-of form of torture? Are a man's bowels to be torn asunder because your cup is broken? You must think a great deal of yourself, if even when the emperor is present, you order men to be executed. 41. If anyone's power is so great that he can treat anger with the tone of a superior, let him crush it out of existence, but only if it be of the kind of which I have just spoken, fierce, inhuman, bloodthirsty, and incurable, save by fear of something more powerful than itself. Let us give the minds that peace which is given by constant meditation upon wholesome maxims, by good actions, and by a mind directed to the pursuit of honour alone. Let us set our own conscience fully at rest, but make no efforts to gain credit for ourselves. So long as we deserve well, let us be satisfied, even if we should be ill spoken of. But the common herd admires spirited actions, and bold men are held in honour, while quiet ones are thought to be indolent. True, at first sight, they may appear to be so, but as soon as the even tenor of their life proves that this quietude arises not from dullness but from peace of mind, then the same populace respects and reverences them. There is, then, nothing useful in that hideous and destructive passion of anger, but on the contrary, every kind of evil, fire and sword. Anger tramples self-restraint underfoot, steeps its hands in slaughter, scatters abroad the limbs of its children. It leaves no place unsoiled by crime. It has no thoughts of glory, no fears of disgrace, and when once anger has hardened into hatred, no amendment is possible. 42. Let us be free from this evil. Let us clear our minds of it, and extirpate, root and branch, a passion which grows again wherever the smallest particle of it finds a resting place. Let us not moderate anger, but get rid of it altogether. What can moderation have to do with an evil habit? We shall succeed in doing this if only we exert ourselves. Nothing will be of greater service than to bear in mind that we are mortal. Let each man say to himself and to his neighbour, why should we, as though we were born to live forever, waste our tiny span of life in declaring anger against anyone? Why should days, which we might spend in honourable enjoyment, be misapplied in grieving and torturing others? Life is a matter which does not admit of waste, and we have no spare time to throw away. Why do we rush into the fray? Why do we go out of our way to seek disputes? Why do we, forgetful of the weakness of our nature, undertake mighty feuds, and, frail though we be, summon up all our strength to cut down other men? Ere long, fever or some other bodily ailment will make us unable to carry on this warfare of hatred which we so implacably wage. Death will soon part the most vigorous pair of combatants. Why do we make disturbances and spend our lives rioting? Fate hangs over our heads, scores up to our account the days as they pass, and is ever drawing nearer and nearer. The time which you have marked for the death of another perhaps includes your own. 43. Instead of acting thus, why do you not rather draw together what there is of your short life, and keep it peaceful for others and for yourself? Why do you not rather make yourself beloved by everyone while you live, and regretted by everyone when you die? Why do you wish to tame that man's pride? Because he takes too lofty a tone with you. Why do you try with all your might to crush that other who snaps and snarls at you, a low and contemptible wretch, but spiteful and offensive to his betters? Master, why are you angry with your slave? Slave, why are you angry with your master? Client, why are you angry with your patron? Patron, why are you angry with your client? Wait but a little while. See, here comes death, who will make you all equals. We often see at a morning performance in the arena a battle between a bull and a bear, fastened together, in which the victor, after he has torn the other to pieces, is himself slain. We do just the same thing. We worry someone who is connected with us, although the end of both victor and vanquished is at hand, and that soon. Let us rather pass the little remnants of our lives in peace and quiet. May no one loathe us when we lie dead. A quarrel is often brought to an end by a cry of fire in the neighbourhood, and the appearance of a wild beast parts the highwayman from the traveller. Men have no leisure to battle with minor evils when menaced by some overpowering terror. What have we to do with fighting and ambuscades? Do you want anything more than death to befall him with whom you are angry? Well, even though you sit quiet, he will be sure to die. You waste your pains. You want to do what is certain to be done. You say, I do not wish necessarily to kill him, but to punish him by exile, or public disgrace, or loss of property. I can more easily pardon one who wishes to give his enemy a wound than one who wishes to give him a blister, for the latter is not only bad, but petty-minded. Whether you are thinking of extreme or slighter punishments, how very short is the time during which either your victim is tortured or you enjoy an evil pleasure in another's pain. This breath that we hold so dear will soon leave us. In the meantime, while we draw it, while we live among human beings, let us practice humanity. Let us not be a terror or a danger to anyone. Let us keep our tempers in spite of losses, wrongs, abuse or sarcasm, and let us endure with magnanimity our short-lived troubles. While we are considering what is due to ourselves, as the saying is, and worrying ourselves, death will be upon us.